Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to my show. My name is Zuffer. I'm your host this morning, and assalamu alaikum to everybody out there this morning. It's a pretty nice day out there. It's a beautiful Sunday morning again. A little bit drizzly occasionally, but I think the weather's going to turn in our favour. So I hope everybody's enjoying their preparations, getting ready for Eid, which will be in a few days' time. I'm certainly busy now thinking about Eid coming up and finishing off our last fasting days. We have a very, very special guest in the studio today. I managed to find our local MEP. So we have Bill Newton-Dunn, who's the newly elected Liberal Democrat MEP for the whole of the East Midlands. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Thank you very much, Zuffer.
First of all, big congratulations. You've been campaigning for a number of weeks, and did you expect to get in? Because there's obviously a lot of competition to get in for becoming an MEP.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting campaign, a very unusual campaign, because Mrs. May, the Prime Minister, said it wasn't going to be an election. There were going to be no elections. So nobody was prepared for it. Nobody was ready. So the selection of candidates, printing of leaflets, making the plans, everything was very short term and a lot of very hard work. But I was optimistic because my party, the Liberal Democrats, said we must remain in Europe. We gave a very clear message and the public responded.
What does that matter to the person walking down Evington Road here this morning? Why does the EU matter to that person? What difference will it make to them? And how is it better for us to be in the EU?
Yeah, okay, very good question. And I understand that not everybody, even though we've been in since 1979, 40 years, not everybody understands. First of all, it's about peace. It's astonishing to think we've had now, my maths isn't too good, but however many, 4 years since 1945 in Europe, we've had continuous peace among nations that have always traditionally fought each other. It's a fantastic achievement, and we shouldn't underestimate the sheer value of peace and not having bombs or guns or boys and girls being marched off forced to join the army and be killed in battles. It's a fantastic achievement, and we don't want to let that go. Second, I think the important reason for being in the EU is that we have a voice and a say in the decisions made by Europe. If we're outside, nobody will listen to us. The rest of Europe will continue making decisions together about climate change or the environment or trade or all the different things that go on in life. Outside, we have no say at all. Inside, we're at the top table. I vote for this area in the Parliament. The national leaders decide with the other leaders. We have a say and we can influence the future. Outside, we've got nothing, so it's very important to be inside.
So the man on the street might be walking down Evington Road, or the person on the street walking down Evington Road today.
Yeah.
What difference does the EU impact on their lives? You know, is it something to do with the climate change? What impact does climate change have on them? What impact does the European arrest warrant and other things that Europe has, what impact does that have on them here?
All those things, and also each one of us as a citizen of the UK has the right to travel freely in the 27 other countries. No reasons to stop you. You've got the freedom to work there, live there, study there. It's a fantastic freedom. We're not just restricted to Leicestershire or the UK. We can go anywhere in 27 other countries, which is a fantastic ability. And the problems that we face, whether it's climate change or organized crime, Europe is fighting together. So we're much more effective than one little country trying to do something on its own. So there are all sorts of benefits, mostly not seen. You don't see them as you walk down the road, but they're there. Freedoms, guaranteed rights, peace, freedom to travel. It's a fantastic situation we're in, and we shouldn't throw it away.
One of the things that you mentioned is climate change. At the radio station here, and many other people from the Muslim community have been fundraising over this last 30 days for various different causes across the world.
Yeah.
And some of those are sort of man-made disasters, some of them are natural disasters.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are occurring because of climate change. What is the EU doing about that, and how much of a difference can it actually make?
Well, the EU was the leader when, maybe 15, 20 years ago, the question of the threat of climate change. Was the planet's climate really warming? Were the ice caps really melting? And maybe 20 years ago, the EU took the world lead to say, we have got to do this. we can't prove it because there's always uncertainty, but it looks increasingly probable that something bad is happening to our planet. Unless we take action together, we'll be very sorry, and our kids and our grandchildren will be extremely angry we did nothing. So the EU took the lead. The Chinese were very slow. The Indians were very reluctant to take any steps. Now the Americans are very reluctant. Donald Trump said it isn't happening and so on. So Europe is taking the lead still in fighting climate change and taking the measures to reduce the increase in temperatures, which is a great danger to us all.
Excellent. You're listening to EAVA 102.5 FM. It's a Ramadan special. My name is Zuffer Hack. I'm your host. We're talking to MEP Bill Newton-Dunn, who's the Liberal Democrat MEP for the whole of the East Midlands. You can call in with your questions on 0116 212 9324, or you can text in on 07450 925 084. You're listening to EAVA 102.5 FM. You mentioned climate change, and you have been a serving MEP. You're the longest serving MEP in the European Parliament, because you've had several different tenures between 1979 and 2014. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, Zuffer, to my own surprise too. As a youngster, I wanted to get into politics because politics is about trying to change the rules, improve society, and I felt I wanted to do that. So I was lucky. I was in the right place at the right time, got elected to the first European Parliament in 1979. I was completely overawed by the famous people who were there, who'd been Willy Brandt, Chancellor of Germany, any number of ex-French prime ministers and people, and I thought, who am I? This is very scary. But I've stuck at it. I've lost 2 elections, but I've won 7 to my amazement. And we take our seats on the 2nd of July in Strasbourg to start the next Parliament. And to my amazement, I am the only survivor left from 1979. So my little grandson says, "Grandpa, you're very old." So I guess I am a bit of a dinosaur, but I'm still very angry and passionate that things need to be improved.
And over those years, what have you been involved in? What has the EU been involved in?
Well, the original big project was creating a single market. It was originally only 9 countries, and then other ones joined, and it went up to today's 28. And the first idea was we can all be more prosperous, and we've got a better chance of freedom and jobs and so on if we create a single market instead of 28 separate markets. So that was a big project. There was an example, for example, beer, simple things, bottles of beer couldn't be sold in different countries from the country they were brewed in. Germany had a law called the Pure Beer Law, which was passed in about 1600, laying down precisely what makes a bottle of beer. And the Germans said, sorry, this is an ancient German law of 400 years old. We cannot change it. So foreign beers cannot come into Germany.
But that probably applied to other things, butters, and all. So there was actually legislation.
There were lots of
product
examples.
types, yeah.
Yes, and the Germans said we're trying to defend this, and one German brewery advertised that foreign beers make men impotent. And we said we don't think that's true because families continue in the rest of Europe. The German had to give way, and now beers, of course.
That's the way of creating a common market or one single market, and that's taken a number of years to do rather than just overnight, isn't it?
Because each country has a special interest it wants to protect, and it still isn't completed. There are still areas where free trade in services and goods still doesn't apply because countries dig in their heels and they make deals with another country. You vote to stop this and we'll vote to help you stop that. So it's a slow business, but the benefit, the freedom of choice we all have is huge. And that was the first project.
That was the first project. And you also mentioned earlier that you were part of the international development team in the EU. What kind of projects were you involved in there?
Well,
where did that take you?
Well, the Parliament has its own committee on helping the rest of the world because we, in this part of the world, in Europe, are very privileged. Life is good. We don't have war. We have health services. We have reasonable peace and quiet, etc., etc. But not every country enjoys that. So Europe deliberately donates aid every year from the European budget to different parts of the world to help. The problem is human nature isn't perfect anywhere, and some of the aid gets into the wrong hands and is misappropriated. But it's a tremendously worthwhile project, and I've hoped that I can get back on that committee, the Development Committee, in the new Parliament starting in July.
And where, what kind of projects have you given to, and what kind of EU support is given to different countries?
Well, an example comes to mind. I remember going out with a little delegation from the committee to India, where we were giving aid. The newspapers in London say, why do we have to help India with aid? Because it's such a rich country now and developing fast. And in Delhi, the attitude was, well, we don't need your help, little Europe. But I remember going out in a bus for about 3 hours south of Hyderabad in the center of India, and we arrived at a little village, I don't remember its name, and there was about 400 people there, and kids gathered from miles around to greet us. And it was fascinating because 5 children made little speeches to the 400 kids who were assembled under an awning in the great heat. And these 5 kids had come from families whose parents had run into deep debt and had put their children under contract to work in the fields for 10 or 15 years to pay off the family debt without wages, and they couldn't go to school. And the EU helped to wipe out these debts so that the kids could go to school. And we listened to these 5 little children released from slavery, effectively, saying to the other kids, school is really good. Don't knock school. It's fantastic. It's the key to your future. And it was very emotional watching this celebration, and thank you to Europe for the aid. Afterwards, I asked one of the aid workers, gosh, that's fantastic. I'm so impressed that this is a really good use of aid. What next? And he said, well, we still have 100,000 more villages to reach in India where the same problem still exists. So Delhi might say, we don't need your help, but actually our aid from Europe does an enormously good job if it's applied on the ground where the need exists.
And how much did you give to that project, or how much do countries like India gain? Because I was reading somewhere that it's tens of billions of euros that go to different projects across the world.
Unfortunately, Zuffer, I don't have the figure in my head, but it's a very considerable sum. The United Nations, 10 years ago, a bit more now, said every country should aim to donate 0.7% of its GNP, its wealth each year, in aid. We're very privileged in Europe. 0.7% isn't a lot to give away.
No.
And Nick Clegg, when he was leader of the Lib Dems a few years ago, got a law through the British Parliament that we British must always give 0.7% of our aid, our GNP in aid, and that still applies despite some other parties in the Parliament not liking that. So we give a lot. I don't have the figures, but we give a lot, and it's a law, so we're holding to it.
Thank you, Bill. You're listening to Radio Ramadan Special on EAVA 102.5 FM. Our phone number is 0116 212 9324, and our text number is 07450 925 084. We've got a question coming in. With the chaos caused by the current government, is there permanent damage to our diplomatic relations with the EU bloc and the wider world? Do you think we've lost credibility? Kevin in Great Glen, Lib Dem member. So do you think there is permanent damage to our diplomatic relations with the EU bloc and the wider world under the current government?
Well, Kevin, good morning. My opinion is yes. I hope it isn't permanent, but although the Lib Dems have had a very good set of election results in the local elections and in the European elections last week, the problem still in front of us is the Brexit. The deadline for the UK leaving is still the 31st of October in about 4 months' time. And that still needs to be resolved. So we've all still got to keep pushing and not sitting back and say we fixed the job. I think there'll be a referendum because Parliament in London is totally deadlocked. We've had 3 years of no decision. So we've got to throw it back to us, the people, to make a decision. So I think there will be a vote. The results of the European elections suggest that public opinion has changed a lot, and the majority of public opinion now wants Britain to stay in.
Well, hang on a second. Nigel Farage is saying that he won the European elections, and that the country wants Brexit.
Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Of course, he can't say anything else. But if you add up the votes of the parties that campaigned for Remain, Lib Dems, Change and Greens, we actually got more votes than the Brexit party. But we've got to test it. That wasn't a referendum. We need a proper vote by the public to settle this. And then, Kevin, I hope that Britain's reputation will be restored as a sensible, important player in Europe.
And the wider world.
Absolutely.
And the wider world. Okay. We were talking earlier, just a little while ago, about your work on the Aid Development Committee on the EU. A lot of people from the Muslim community over this holy month of Ramadan give a lot of aid and a lot of money. We do quite a lot of collections on Radio Ramadan for various different projects across the world, and we end up collecting millions of pounds. So the EU is really in a place where you're giving out billions of pounds worth of aid to various different projects across the world, and do you think that's very similar to what the Muslim community do for because we give 2.5%, you're saying 0.7, so the EU does it on a collective basis, really?
Yes, it does. And each of the 28 member countries of the EU also have their own aid budgets. The problem, Zuffer, is they don't talk to each other enough, and you can get duplication. And it's very important, if we're all giving aid, which is a wonderful and a good thing to do, that we sure that we know what each other is doing. I was told a story a few years ago. There was a big earthquake in Turkey, and so a lot of aid was rushed from all sorts of different people to help with tents and water and blankets and so on. But it turned out the national governments didn't talk to each other, and so too many tents were provided and not enough water, for example. So we're all doing the right thing, but we need to coordinate better and see we're not duplicating it.
Excellent. We have another question coming in. How come a party called Brexit won the European elections when their whole aim is to get out of Europe?
Well, it's a very good question, and even more mysterious. They didn't have a manifesto. They didn't have any policies. It was Nigel Farage saying, write me a blank cheque, chaps, and let me do whatever I like, and I won't tell you what I'm going to do. It's a very undemocratic way to proceed, because you should ask every politician before they stand for election, so if we vote for you, what will you do? I think it was a protest vote, and we'll see when we get the Peterborough by-election coming up next week, and then a referendum across the country.
You're listening to Radio Ramadan on EAVA 102.5 FM. Our telephone number is 0116 212 9324, and our text number is 07450 925 084. You're listening to Radio Ramadan on EAVA 102.5 FM. You mentioned earlier that you were on various different committees. What other things have you been involved in while you've been a member of the European Parliament? Well,
you're always involved in the most important thing is the problems of your constituents, the people who live around here. And when I was an MEP up till 2014, I was getting 400 emails every day. So there were lots of problems, every kind of problems under the sun. Often they're nothing to do with Europe. Some people would say, my dustbins weren't emptied last week. What are you going to do about it? And I'd have to say, well, it isn't actually Brussels that empties the dustbins. Check in with your local council. Somebody's gone wrong there. So sometimes it's nothing to do with my responsibilities, but they can be bigger questions. So that's the primary job. And then you look at the other bigger problems, like climate change, which is the biggest problem of all. Another big problem, which has been concerning me and I'm going to go on working on, is the spread of organized crime, which is sort of hidden. They don't publicize what they do. They don't publish an annual report like a business, but it's there. And the real problem is that while our police, and in Britain we have something like 100 different police forces, one for each county and then transport police and so on, and they each work within their own little worlds. And our police can't cross borders. The Leicestershire police can't cross into Nottinghamshire, for example. They've got to ring up somebody and say, could you check, that car's disappeared down the M1 and too late now. The criminals don't have to get permission at all for crossing borders, and they're everywhere and undercover. And in my opinion, Europe needs to create an FBI, a police force that can cross the borders and chase the bad guys and stop them.
Yeah, because there's a huge problem with drugs and other sort of activities that organised crime is involved in. And actually, the European arrest warrant has been a hugely positive effect, because people can get from one part of the country, one part of Europe to another within hours now. Really, it's very easy to travel by air, by rail, and by sea.
Yeah, and since we have open borders, and you and I, we've all got rights to travel freely in Europe, so have the bad guys too, but the police can't pursue them. So we've got a lot of work to do to get this right.
We've been through a very strange European election where there has been a number of people, and I think I was reading somewhere the former Deputy Prime Minister Michael Heseltine, member of the Tory party, actually voted for you.
Voting is a private matter, but in the Sunday Times newspaper 2 Sundays ago, he wrote a big article in the centre of it saying, I'm a Tory, but the Tories are completely wrong about Europe. And he said, I strongly recommend people to vote for the Liberal Democrats and Bill Newton-Dunn. But how he actually personally voted, we can all guess, but we don't know.
Do you actually know? Have you ever met Michael Heseltine?
Yes, over the years, a number of times. He's a highly intelligent, very charismatic man. I remember perhaps the first time I met him years ago when he was maybe Deputy Prime Minister to Margaret Thatcher. And Margaret Thatcher was actually a good European. She signed the Single Act, she introduced majority voting, so she made Europe move forward and be more effective. But she used to, in her speeches, attack Europe and swing her famous handbag, because it's always easy to blame foreigners and not the government. And I remember once talking to Michael Heseltine then, when Mrs. Thatcher was the Prime Minister, saying, look, Michael, why don't you get the leaders of industry, the big companies in Britain who employ hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people, chemical companies, car companies, take those leaders into Number 10 and have them tell Mrs. Thatcher that we need Europe, we need the single market, and she shouldn't knock it like that. And he said, Bill, I've already done that. I said, well, if you don't mind me saying so, nothing seems to have happened when you took all these great men in to see her. What happened? He said it was astonishing. All these very important businessmen went in and they became like small schoolboys, quivering in front of this dominant prime minister. And he said what actually happened was she gave a fierce lecture. I'm the boss, you must do what I tell you. And these hugely powerful businessmen went out without saying a word. He said, Michael Heseltine said, I was very shocked and very disappointed. But politicians like to speak. Businessmen don't want to speak too much about politics in public.
Wow, that's a very good insight into what was happening in Downing Street in the 1980s, I think. That was
probably then,
probably
yes.
1980s.
Yeah.
You're listening to Radio Ramadan on 102.5 FM. This is the community show. We've got Bill Newton-Dunn, who is the MEP for the East Midlands, on with us this morning. Bill, we were talking about Europe and why we should be in Europe. Many people were sort of quite surprised at the position of different parties, but the Lib Dems have they been quite clear on this?
The Lib Dems have always been the strong pro-European party, say we've got to stay in. And I remember Michael Heseltine again a few years ago saying to me, I cannot understand how successive Conservative Prime Ministers, Thatcher, Major and so on, have always been pro-European, and now the Conservative Party has become so anti. So the Lib Dems have always been very strongly pro-European, yes.
Excellent. You're listening to Radio Ramadan on 102.5 FM. This is an EAVA special programme, and our telephone number is 0116 212 9324. After the break, we will be coming back with further questions. We'll be talking about Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, Brexit, Nigel Farage, what's going on in this world, and where we should be. So please join us after the break. Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to our show. I'm your host Zuffer Hack. We're running the community show this morning. This is Radio Ramadan on EAVA 102.5 FM. We're talking to Bill Newton-Dunn, who is the European Member of Parliament for the East Midlands, who's been talking about how he got elected recently. The reason why we've done this show, the main reason why we've decided to do this show, is because we want to inform the community, inform people why Europe is so important. There's been a lot of ear bashing, a lot of bashing of the EU for many, many years. For the last 30, 40 years, it's a corrupt organisation. It doesn't work, doesn't run. And there's so many negatives that have featured in the media over the last 40 years. What do you say to that, Bill? Why is that? Is that a challenge for you? And is that some narrative that you need to change?
Yeah, I'll be working very hard on trying to change that, but it's a difficult thing to change. Human beings are not perfect, so there is inefficiency and corruption everywhere, in our streets, in our towns, in our cities, in our country, in Europe as well. It's unfortunate, and we always have to fight against it. And it's always convenient if something goes wrong to say, well, it's not my fault. It's Brussels' fault. It's foreigners who've made the silly mistake. So there's an awful lot of need of transparency, of knowing what's really going on. And if people want to ask us, now Zuffer, that's great. But equally, after the program is over, if people want to contact me by email, they're very welcome to, and I'll answer the questions later too. But we've got lots of information. The problem is getting it out to people.
So you have your own website. You'll have your own details on the European Parliament website, and people will be able to contact you directly.
There are lots of ways with this amazing modern world of the internet. Yes.
Yep. We've got a comment coming in. Lily Kaufman, very good interview. Newton-Dunn speaking a lot of good sense. So, Bill, the other question I really wanted to ask you is, you obviously are very passionate about being a member of the European Parliament, and you've just spoken that you think it's not perfect, but it's okay, and it works and it runs. People say that about the current government. There was a comment earlier about the current government and other things as well. So nothing is ever perfect, but it's a work in progress. You've been working on this project for about 40 years, in on and off, in the European Parliament. What would you like to see happen in the next 4 years, if indeed you get 4 years? Because if Britain comes out of the EU, you won't get 4 years. It might only be 4 weeks or 2 weeks or whatever it might be.
Absolutely. I think, Zuffer, if there's one thing that I would really like to be able to achieve is more transparency and openness, so people actually know what's really happening. Because whenever there's secrecy, there's an opportunity for corruption or doing things wrong. I discovered a while ago that in Sweden, which is a pretty model, well-run country, they've had a freedom of information law for more than 200 years. 200 years, whereas Britain's had one for 10 and it's only partial. MPs' expenses are exempted from the British law of transparency, whereas in Sweden, if the Swedish Prime Minister writes something on a piece of paper, that is immediately public property. Everybody in Sweden can see everything that is done in their parliament and their government. And as a result, there's less corruption and more fairness. And I would like to see more transparency right across Europe, in Britain too, so we know what's really going on.
That's a very important point you've just made there, because there is the Freedom of Information Act in the UK, but it is very limited, and doesn't give you as much transparency. And you think that that's something that you're quite keen to pursue over the next 4 years. But it's also interesting that Sweden had this 200 years ago, and that amazed me because I didn't know about that. So you are keen to take some of the positives around Europe and bring them into the UK and make them into European law, and that's what Europe is about, is it?
Yes, it is. All the positives should be better known and understood, but also the bad things should be exposed too, so we can say, hey, that's going wrong, look what somebody's up to over there, and try and correct that. So the more openness, transparency for all of us in every aspect of our lives is more healthy and fair for everybody.
We're going into the European Parliament very shortly, aren't you? You're going in July. Britain has got an extension until the 31st of October. What's going to happen? What do you think is going to happen? And what happens if Britain comes out with no deal? How does that impact people on the streets here?
Well, what's going to happen, honestly, nobody knows. It's astonishing. Literally nobody knows. My son, who is a political commentator on the Sun newspaper, doesn't know either. He tells me that Theresa May didn't know what was going to happen. It's chaos and very scary. I think that there has, as I said earlier in the programme, we need another referendum, let the people give their verdict, because Parliament can't decide. And then I think people will vote to stay in. Public opinion has changed, and we'll stay in, and our deadline of the 31st of October will be either abolished or extended a long time. We can get on with the real job. But that's the immediate mountain to climb, and that is decided not by the European Parliament, but it's a British question, so by the British Parliament in London.
But how do businesses, and many business people I speak to on a sort of daily basis, always ask the same question? What's happening? How can we plan our future? We don't know whether to set up in Europe or stay in the UK. We've got businesses, we trade in Europe. What do we do? How do we function? It's surely very bad planning. No company at this moment in time can have a long-term strategy of investment or expansion plan.
Yeah, I agree. If we had we just crashed out of the EU with no deal, it would be a catastrophe, because that means that all agreements with every other country in the world are off. We've crashed out of everything, and that would mean a lot of trade would stop, because there'd be no agreement of whether wine can come in from France or you and I can travel on a vacation. That all stops. It's unimaginably stupid thing to have a hard Brexit, but it makes very good politics for people to stand up and shout for that. Now, I would like to see ordinary businessmen, and I know businessmen don't like to get into politics, so do it running their businesses, but they should be expressing their opinion, particularly now when things are so worrying and alarming. Ordinary, every businessman should be saying to their local MP, look, this is intolerable, sort this out, let us stay inside, and we can get on with the single market and providing jobs and prosperity.
And that will impact on people on the streets, because the jobs won't be there, as you said.
Well, if we did a hard Brexit, jobs would disappear very fast. In the East Midlands, we have car manufacturing, we've got Rolls-Royce, we've got lots of big companies, we've got a lot of farmers, and they wouldn't be able to export because there would be no agreement with the other countries who would be normally buying their goods. It's insanity to have a hard Brexit. But nobody understands it. That's why Nigel Farage in the European elections said, oh, give me a blank cheque. I won't explain what I would do, because he hasn't got any policies. It's just a populist idea. So we, the public and businessmen and ordinary people, should voice themselves now, because it's a very dangerous time for Britain. We need to stay in to protect our futures.
Okay, you're listening to Radio Ramadan on EAVA 102.5 FN. Our phone number is 0116 212 9324. Our text number is 07450 925 084. I'm your host, Zuffer Hack. You're listening to Bill Newton-Dunn, the East Midlands Member of European Parliament. Bill, you mentioned and you spoke just a second ago, jobs. That matters to people on these streets in Leicester and across the East Midlands. And a lot of companies are fearful. Have they been contacting you and supporting you, or what are they saying to you?
Not enough, no. Businessmen are rather shy, and we had on the TV screen we got up here somebody saying, "Oh, politics is fine, but I'm trying to run my business." People have got to speak up now and say, this is extremely serious, and we want clarity, and we want to stay in and have the freedoms we've got not thrown away. And people aren't saying enough, and I haven't had enough messages. We need to express our views now very clearly and forcefully and loudly.
Okay, we're currently in a bit of a limbo with the current government. There will be a Prime Minister until the 7th or 10th of June, and then we're in a time where there's a new leadership election. So the current leader of the Conservative Party is now changing, and the Conservative Party members will decide who the next leader is, or who the next Prime Minister indeed. And there's quite a lot of people in that race. Majority of them are actually wanting a no deal. How does that make you feel?
Deeply alarmed and frightened for the future of jobs and prosperity in our country. And what is even more iniquitous, Zuffer, is that, yes, it's Theresa May is resigning on next Friday as Prime Minister, although she'll stand by just to keep things ticking over. The Conservative Party will elect a new leader. They have about 100,000 members. Most of them are over 60. And it's quite intolerable that our country's leader should be elected by just 100,000 people belonging to one political party, with youth almost totally excluded. If we have a national leader, surely they should at least be elected in a general election, not just appointed by a small number of people of one party. It's a very dangerous time.
And the front runner in this currently is Boris Johnson, who's just been backed by Donald Trump in the last 24 hours.
Yeah.
And there is several people in the frame, but Boris Johnson's name keeps coming up. And what kind of alliance is actually forming here with Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, and maybe even Nigel Farage got a mention this morning?
Well, you're right, Zuffer. My son, the journalist on The Sun, got the interview with Donald Trump in the White House last week. And Trump, my son says that Trump just speaks from the hip, like a Wild West shooter, and with emotion, and doesn't really think what he says. And he came out with this remark, yes, Boris Johnson's a great guy. If you follow Twitter in the last couple of days, a little Twitter remark by Boris when he was mayor of London has been circulating, has gone viral, where Boris says Donald Trump is the worst thing ever, not welcome in this country, and so on. So although Trump is praising Boris, Boris is on record as saying Trump is awful and we don't want him here. So this is quite unclear what's going on.
So it's a strange alliance, isn't it?
It's a very strange alliance. And I think, like all politicians, Trump is starting to think, well, where are my allies for the next election in America, which is next year now? And he's beginning to think, well, I must get support from everybody, and Boris is a good guy and Farage is a good guy. He doesn't think much. He just speaks.
You've got you've got a state visit for Donald Trump starting tomorrow. He's flying in probably as we speak from the US. What do you think about America and Donald Trump and his stance? And can Britain get a trade deal with them, really?
No, you can't get Britain is in the EU, and we, the 28 countries, negotiate trade deals together because that gives us much more muscle when dealing with other countries. So we can't until we leave. But when you look at Donald Trump, who's had a real fight about trade with Canada, and he's having a huge fight with China about trade, and he's just threatened his other neighbor, Mexico, with all sorts of tariffs about their trade too. I don't think we'd get a very comfortable deal from Trump, even if we started to try. And the other thing that really scares me about his visit coming tomorrow is I'm reading in the paper that the Beast, his gigantic protected motor car that's coming in that protects him against every kind of attack, flying that thing which weighs any number of tons, and a number of decoy cars also come in, and something like 10,000 Secret Servicemen to protect him. What is the effect on the climate of all this stuff being flown across the Atlantic for 3 days of pageantry in Britain? It doesn't make sense, but Trump doesn't support climate change either. So we're in a pretty crazy world.
Would you say you're the opposite side to Donald Trump?
I think I probably am, listening to myself, Zuffer, yes.
Yes. Okay. We have a situation where a lot of people are now talking about WTO rules. Yeah. We can leave a no-deal Brexit on WTO rules. What does that mean to Britain as a country for exports?
Well, it means the absolute bare minimum. And you have to ask yourself, well, which other countries in the world trade on WTO rules? And the answer is none at all. Every other country in the world feels the need of special treaties with its partners. What actually we're allowing in, or what are we doing, what are the conditions, what are the tariffs, and so on. WTO rules means almost nothing, just a very basic, like learning to read at school an alphabet, but it doesn't actually say what the rules are. And the very fact that no other country trades on only WTO rules should tell us that this is a stupid thing for Britain to try and adopt.
But this is something that has been expressed as really an alternative. But from what you're saying, it isn't.
It isn't. But you see, in politics, it's very easy to be populist and and back to Farage, fighting an election without a manifesto. He doesn't say what he's going to do. He doesn't talk about WTO rules. He doesn't talk about what they mean. It's just a populist slogan. Bring back the good old days, and we don't like foreigners. It's very irresponsible, but unfortunately people have got busy lives and they haven't got time to check into what does this all mean, because they've got to get the kids to school and do the business and all the things we all have to do every day. So Farage and Boris get away with murder by claiming things which people don't check.
So WTO rules are just a baseline, basic book of rules that allows you to trade with countries around the world, but it takes time to negotiate those treaties and build on that.
Yeah, you want to say, well, how many aeroplanes are we going to let in each day, and who's got landing slots at the airports, and how many apples and pears are we letting in from which countries, and sugar comes from different countries. People want to sell it to us. WTO doesn't set any of the rules and the limits and the tariffs on those. So it's the very bare minimum, and it isn't enough.
So, if in actual fact that most of that work has already been done by the EU with trading with different countries.
Yeah, we are governed with all sorts of rules with between the EU and the whole of all the other countries in the world, with China, with America, with African countries, and so on. I can't imagine Farage would tear up the rule book and start it completely from scratch. It takes years. And if you're negotiating with the Chinese or the Americans, this is tough, and you can't just do it overnight. Leaving without any deal is a recipe for chaos in this country, and people would be very angry when they discovered what had actually happened.
And it will affect people walking down the street in Evington and across this Leicestershire and the East Midlands by jobs.
By jobs and by the things in the shops which are imported, by every aspects of our life. Yes, it would be really scary, and we've definitely got to draw back from that.
Okay, we're going to go on to Donald Trump. You mentioned earlier again, and your son did an interview with him last week.
Yes,
as
he
you
did,
mentioned
yes.
earlier.
Yes.
How do you find have you been to America, and how do you find the trading and relationships that the EU is currently setting up with America?
We have a very good, the EU, Europe as a whole, has a very good trading arrangement with the USA, but we have some differences. The Americans subsidize their agriculture hugely, not least by very, very cheap fuel prices for diesel and petrol, where they have almost no tax on them. So we disagree about that. The Americans want to sell us large numbers of chickens that have been treated with chlorine, because they say that gets rid of all the bugs and diseases, but I don't think many people here fancy eating chicken when it's got chlorine, which is a dangerous chemical in it. So we have all sorts of detailed differences, and every day Europe and the USA are talking about these details and trying to reach agreements, and the Parliament has a big say in what we accept and what isn't. But my impression from my son is that Trump just shoots from the hip, says whatever he thinks without really thinking the consequences. And he seems to like picking fights with everybody, with China, Mexico, Canada, and Europe too. So this is a dangerous man, and luckily he's got some sensible officials around him who hold him back, I think, and tone down what he says.
He's very keen for us to be out of Europe, though, isn't he?
Yeah,
I mean, the comments made today that leave with a no deal and bring in
Yes.
Nigel Farage to negotiate with you.
Yes. He doesn't explain why, of course, like Farage doesn't explain why, but it makes a great headline, and Trump is a terrific guy because he was a big TV host in America before he became a politician and president. But he doesn't spell this stuff out. He doesn't do detail at all. He just fights on the hip, and he's very good at making deals and fighting people because that's his business experience. He's not a more subtle thinking politician, which is what the world really needs.
The European market's about 500 million.
Yes.
The UK's population is about 65 million.
Yes.
And why do you think that we can't do better on our own? Why can Britain not do its own trade agreements with different countries around the world and actually make a difference by going it alone?
Well, for example, take car manufacturing. Cars now are different parts of each motor car are made in different countries. The steering wheel in one country, the engine in another, the wheels in a third country. And they all work very fast together, integrating, moving the parts about, and the final thing is assembled somewhere. We don't make complete cars in Britain, nor does any country. So if we suddenly quit, and our car manufacturers will be stuck because they won't have the parts to complete the cars. So the car industry would suffer an enormous downturn. And it applies to equally to all the other products that we trade in and the services too. We're very integrated with our European neighbours now. And if you start suddenly cutting off all these complicated and friendly arrangements we made over many years, it's only a recipe for disaster.
Okay, you're listening to Radio Ramadan on EAVA 102.5 FM. If you've got any messages, you can text us on 07450 925 084, or you can call into the studio. Telephone number is 0116 212 9324. You're listening to Bill Newton-Dunn, Member of the European Parliament for the East Midlands. I'm your host, Zuffer Hack. I hope you find the show interesting. We've been talking about all sorts of things: Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, the EU, how it's not perfect, and how it can hopefully become more and more perfect over the next few years. Over the last few weeks, it's been a strange world in the political arena. You've had a lot of people. You had Alistair Campbell voting for former Tony Blair, head of communications, voting for the Liberal Democrats, and then been suspended. And many people in the Labour Party who actually voted for the Liberal Democrats in this election. Why do you think that is? And what would you urge the Labour Party people to be thinking about?
Well, the Labour Party's problem was that Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't say whether he was for or against Brexit. And so Labour Party voters and supporters were very confused, and some of them came to us, and many of them probably didn't vote at all. I think, so for what's happening now is we're at a time of great change. Britain won the war in 1945, a long time ago, and we decided we were perfect. We don't need to change, we're perfect. Everybody else has to change, but not us. And suddenly we're finding out, 70 years later, we're far from perfect. We've got an upper house that isn't elected at all. All the lords are just put there on nice allowances, and they're put there because they're friends of prime ministers. It's totally undemocratic. We have a huge amount to change, and the Lib Dems are the great radical party that would change the voting system, have an elected upper house, stay in Europe, all sorts of other things too. Lots of work to be done.
Other people would say, if we had Nigel Farage here, he would be saying, well, 17.3 million people voted in the biggest democratic election to leave the EU. Why are we still there, and why should we actually have a second vote?
Well, what happened to those 73? They didn't vote in the European elections. Farage got about 7 million votes, so 10 million no longer supported him. And that's partly because studies and polls show that the people who vote for Brexit are the more elderly ones with memories of a glorious past and of empire and so on. And young people don't vote for Farage. And public opinion has changed now, and people are saying, well, it's fine. Farage is an amusing guy and he smiles a lot, but he has no policies and he doesn't tell us what his policies would be. So he's not worth supporting, and in the European elections, 10 million people abandoned him compared to 2016.
So your message is you would like a second referendum, allow people to change their minds?
Yes, absolutely. I'm convinced, looking at the results in the European elections last week, the figures have shifted. I think people are beginning to understand that we need to stay in Europe, imperfect though we've said, as we've discussed, Zuffer, and needs changing, but it's better than the scary, friendless world outside.
Okay, we were talking to Bill Newton-Dunn, Member of the European Parliament for the whole of the East Midlands. How can people contact you? We've got a very short amount of time. People can contact you on your email address via the European Parliament website.
Lots of ways. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. My email address is newtondunbill, the other way round, at gmail.com. There are lots of ways. Or go onto the European Parliament website or the East Midlands Lib Dems website.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's been a pleasure to have you here, an honour and pleasure, really. You're listening to Radio Ramadan. I wish everybody an Eid Mubarak. Any message from you, Bill?
No, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Zuffer. We could go on much longer, I suspect.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.